And I want to welcome to the water management class for trees webinar that we can share all the wonderful information about water as it relates to the trees. And so let me share my screen, and we're going to revisit the ideal soil, this area that trees will need to grow. So we've talked about this when we talked about soil, that there are some important components that trees are going to need. And so if you look at number 2 here, that's going to be water and air. That is going to be the balancing and determines whether a tree is going to live or die. So this is going to be the most important thing, or a very important thing for trees to be very happy. So when we look at water, we are going to talk about the way that water is going to move, whether it be you activate the sprinklers, whether it be the rain comes in during the fall season and into the spring, or however water gets delivered to the trees. So it's going to be a couple of important things. The first thing is going to be infiltration. The water needs to penetrate the soil. We already talked about the roots of the tree that are going to be found within the top 2 to 3 feet on the surface of the soil. So that's because that's where the water is going to be available. And so here is just an image, normal urban scenario where you have the roots of the tree wherever they're able to grow. And so the water needs to penetrate or infiltrate the soil. So we talked about soil before, and we know that the type of soil the tree is growing on is going to play a very important role. Whether the soil is primarily sandy, that is going to allow a very quick infiltration, keeping in mind that as the water moves through the soil, it's going to be moving towards the pore space, or the spaces, the natural spaces that are found within the soil itself. If it moves very quickly, then it's going to be moving away from the root area. And so water that goes below the root zone of the tree is not going to be available to the tree. So that's very important, that it needs to move quick enough to return the oxygen, but not so quick that it's not going to allow the tree to drink. And vice versa, when you have the clay or soil that are predominantly clay, the water is going to move very slow, taking with it the oxygen that is going to be important for the tree to grow. So the soil will play a major role, the type of soil, because it is the water that is being held, or that is held by the soil particles where the roots are growing, that is going to be allowed, or is going to be available to the tree for a prolonged period of time. And that is very important. So you might need to add organic matter to make the area better for the tree or the roots, or for the organic matter to be incorporated into the soil so that it can hold water for a prolonged period of time. Soils that are predominantly sandy are going to dry very quickly, and the sand particles are not going to hold the water for a prolonged period of time, which means you're going to have to water that tree a lot more or more often. Soils that are predominantly clay are going to hold water for a very long time, and those will not be needed for you to water as often, but they're going to hold the water for such a long time that the oxygen may be not available to the roots, and the roots will then rot and they'll die. So it's a give and take on both of them. So here is the soil aggregates, a product of organic matter in the soil. So the organic matter is going to create what is known as that humic acid, that will in turn take the different soil particles, bind them together into bigger chunks, improving the drainage, improving the water holding capacity of the soil, improving the vitamin and mineral holding capacity of the soil as well. So creating the macropores, or the big spaces for the water to drain, and the micropores for areas where the water is going to be held and be made available to the plant. So when the soil has achieved this aggregate, it's going to be the ideal soil that still has a lot of oxygen for the plants, for the roots of the trees, but still going to have enough water. So that is what we are striving to achieve with whatever soil we are given so that we can provide the best growing environment for the tree. So when we are going to be watering the ground for the trees, what's going to happen is that eventually when the water infiltrates, the water that is going to move towards through the soil particles and below the root zone, that's going to be known as gravitational water. Gravitational water is going to be not available to the trees. It's just going to follow in gravity, respecting gravity. So it's going to go through the roots, through the soil particle, usually below the area where the roots are held. When all of the soil particles have been filled, then the water available to the plants is going to be the capillary water. This is the water held by the soil particles. And when all the particles are filled, the soil has reached what is known as field capacity, which means that all the particles are full. I cannot, if I keep adding more water to this area, it's just going to drain out and it's not going to be used by the trees or by anything. So it's just going to be drained into the soil. Water is going to be lost from the soil. So trees are going to drink the water. Some water is going to evaporate. And so as water begins to be depleted from the soil, eventually the water is going to be known as hygroscopic. That means that there is still water in the soil, but it's held so tightly by the soil particles that it then becomes unavailable to the plant. So there is a little bit of moisture, but no longer able to be drunk or eaten or available to the plant. And so this is very important. So at this point, we are going to begin to see wilting on trees. So the water plays another major role in allowing some of the young tender shoots to be upright. It's called turgid pressure. And so the water pressure is going to keep the tips of the tree kind of upright. So the moment that water begins to deplete, when it's no longer available to the plant, then the tips of the tree are going to begin to wilt. And that is going to be a symptom. That is when you need to start watering. So that is going to be known as the wilting point. So where you see that damage. So you need to keep your soil moist enough where it's going to be above the wilting point or water when the plants begin to develop the wilt, but then stop watering it when it has reached field capacity because it is no longer able to take any more water. So right in the middle where you have all of the particles filled with soil, but you still have oxygen available or returns back to the soil is where the plant needs to be at all times for it to be very happy. Some trees can survive the extreme or one or the other. There's going to be those water-loving trees like the willows that grow naturally along the streams that could be in a very waterlogged environment and they're happy there. Or there's going to be the desert type trees where they're not used to having so much water, or their metabolism allows them to take or be able to sequester that water that is being held tight by the soil particles. It'll take energy, but they can eventually take it out, or they're more opted for taking that water out of the soil particles. So to water the trees, wait until they have started to wilt a little, then no problem. You water them, and the moment you see water running off or you begin to see it kind of running away, then you need to stop and let the water seep, and then that becomes available to the trees. And so, yes, the space, as we've seen this before, the spaces in between the soil particles is very important for that drainage component. So where you have the clay-like soils, I mentioned before, the spaces are very close, or the particles are very close together. The space is very narrow, so oxygen can be depleted here, and water will not. And when you have the sandy soils, the particles are going to be further apart. The space between them is going to be wider. Oxygen is going to be plentiful, but water is going to drain very quickly and not be available to the plant. So that is the problem. And obviously the solution is going to be organic matter that will fix all of this through the soil aggregates. And so we added the water. Now our soil is to fill capacity. Now the transpiration or the loss of water through the plant is going to begin. So that is going to be known as transpiration. The water is going to be absorbed by the roots from the soil, and it's going to go into the valuable areas or where it's needed within the plant. This is where photosynthesis will come in. So the trees are going to have a very important balancing act or balancing game. So they need the water because the water is going to be required for photosynthesis. So water is going to be required. The water is going to be absorbed from the soil through the roots. They also going to require the carbon dioxide. The carbon dioxide, which is going to be absorbed through the leaves. And in the presence of the light, then the tree will create sugar, which is going to use for its biological functions. And as a byproduct, it is going to release oxygen. And so carbon dioxide and water is going to be very, very important. And the moment the sunlight comes up or the sun comes up, this will be initiated. This is just the photosynthesis because this will happen primarily inside the leaves, and it's going to be in the presence of the chlorophyll or the green pigment. Or it could also happen on a green stem if the plant happens to have a green stem or any other green component of the plant that can carry out photosynthesis as well. And so the the carbon dioxide is absorbed through tiny openings, and we can refer to them as miniature noses for a plant. This is where when the sun comes up, the stomatas are going to open. Once they open, they are going to be normally located underneath or on the underside of the leaves because that also tends to be very humid. And protected from drying out severely. So the moment that the stomata opens, the tree will begin to lose water via the transpiration. So the balancing act, the balancing game for the tree is that it needs to open, it must open the stomata to absorb the carbon dioxide. But if it keeps the stomata open for a prolonged period of time, it will eventually run out of water in the soil and the tree may desiccate and it may die. So as long as water is plentiful in the soil, the tree can have their stomata open. They could be carrying out photosynthesis. The plant is going to be producing resources, and the tree is going to be very happy and grow very quickly and be very, very healthy. But the moment that the soil begins to dry out, the stomatas are not going to open. Or if it reaches that wilting point where if the stomatas were to open and the tree would continue to lose the water, then the tree will desiccate and it will die, or it will eventually die because it will not have any water. So that is the balancing act. It needs the carbon dioxide. It is forced to open the stomata. It's going to lose some water. And so how long is it going to be open? Until the water runs out. And then once the tree is unable to open the stomata because there's no more water, then it's simply going to be living off of whatever stored energy it has. And if that stored energy happens to run out, the tree will then die because there has nothing to eat and it'll literally starve to death. And so when you look at a very tall tree, the very tip of the tree has leaves and there's stomata. So the water, here I am for scale, the water happens to be absorbed from the soil, and it could climb 200, 300 feet up into the air. That is a lot of work for a tree. And so that could take a lot of energy if the tree wasn't smart to do it kind of effortlessly. So there are very important components of water that you need to be aware of. Cohesion forces is going to be part of the nature of the molecules of water is that they would have a tendency to stick to one another. And so when you look here as the water molecule, they have a positive charge on one side and a negative charge on the other. And so the positive will be attracted to the negative. And so we have what is known as a change of the water molecules. And so water will tend to stick to one another. And that is going to be very important because the plant is able to take the water and pump it up or bring it up to the 300, 400 feet, however tall that tree may be, without using any energy. Because if we were to use energy, it would be very expensive for the tree. And we have the same problem in California. We have to pump the water with energy over the Mulholland Drive and into the valley of LA. And it's a lot of energy to get the water in here. It's the same phenomena, but tree does it without any expending any energy. So that is cohesion. So the ability of the molecules of water to stick to one another. And so when we have here the other factor, which is going to be adhesion or the adhesion force, and that is going to be the ability of those water molecules to stick to the surface or a surface. And so here's an example of a soda pop. And so when you stick the straw into the soda pop is going to stick to the walls of the straw, and that is how you have the rise of the meniscus, or the soda pop is going to go up the straw. So that's because of the ability of the water to absorb to the walls of the straw. And so if you look at this example, a wall of the straw is equivalent to the vascular system or the xylem of the tree that we talked about. So when you take both of this component together, cohesion and adhesion, then you have the absorption of the liquid by a napkin. Remember, the napkin is made of fibers from plants, which the fibers is or will be part of the vascular system. And so when you take a napkin and you put it or simply lay it on top of a water or soda pop, it's going to be absorbed. It's going to be absorbed by a adhesion or adhesing itself to the walls of the fibers. And then it's going to go up the napkin because it's going to be pulling the water molecules behind it. So this, we use it all the time. We don't think about it, but this is the important component of water that allow the water to go up. So this is one example. The other example is going to be a water fountain. Here you have a very nice, beautiful stream of water that is done by the same thing. The water molecules kind of binding itself to one another creates this beautiful water stream, adhesion and cohesion in action. And so when we now look at the plant has a chain of water molecules that is going to begin in the soil where the roots are going to be making contact with the soil particles to absorb the water. That chain of water molecules is going to move through the roots, up the stem via the xylem, and it's going to end at the stomata or the stoma for the tree. And so the way that the tree is able to move water 300 feet or up into the air is that when a molecule of water is lost to the environment via the transpiration of the tree. So remember, it opens the stomata, it begins to lose water through the water vapor to the transpiration. So the water molecules are going to go into the air. And as one molecule of water gets released or lost to the air, one molecule of water is absorbed by the root. And as more molecules of water gets lost to the air, more molecules of water keeps getting pushed up into the root and absorbed. And so it is very, very crucial that this chain continues, that it doesn't break, because it's very difficult for the tree to regain or reestablish this chain. And so if the tree happens to go bone dry, or it goes into a severe water stress where there is absolutely no water in the soil, then the chain is broken. Then when you water the tree, it will be a certain amount of time before the tree is able to regain that chain. And that will usually take a little bit more energy out of the tree. So as long as water is available in the soil, the chain is going to be working passively by releasing the molecule of water to the air and absorbing one from the soil. And so this is how water is going to move up through the vascular system, through the xylem of the plant, and out into the air. And this is why it is a one-way system. Water does not move down from the tree into the soil because of this connection to the chain, because water does not get lost, at least not normally lost through evaporation through the roots. So one way from the roots to the stomata, and connection to the soil particles. And so when we look at a simple normal citrus tree, in a single day, their tree could evaporate gallons upon gallons of water. So it's not just a little. The next time it's very hot, just go sit underneath a tree. Underneath a tree, it feels nice and cool because the tree is transpiring water. And the somatas are found underneath the leaves, because underneath the leaves is protected from the sun, so the water is not going to evaporate as quickly, so it's not going to lose as much. And it also creates a nice microclimate where the water is not going to be lost any quicker, but still going to be able to absorb the carbon dioxide. So a tree, maybe a 10, 20 foot tree can lose 30, 40, 50 gallons of water in a single day. And so when you now multiply that by a much larger tree that has a much bigger canopy, a lot more leaves, those gallons can be now increased by a lot more. And so a tree requires a lot of water, or it can go through a lot of water in the process of carrying out that photosynthesis. And so we have here now what is known as evapotranspiration. So evaporation is the loss of water from the surface via either the air, via either the heat. And so when you add both, evapotranspiration is the loss of water from the soil when normally when there's a very hot day, and it also has very low humidity. So when relative humidity is low, the evapotranspiration is going to be much higher. Around here, that would be in the summer. We have very hot, very dry summers. So evapotranspiration is going to be high. Sometimes we get the Santa Ana winds. That is going to increase the evapotranspiration. So the water loss by evaporation and by transpiration. So from the trees, and also just from the surface of the soil or the surrounding areas. During our fall, winter, when here in Southern California, Long Beach, we get our rain. We have very high humidity. We have kind of misty days. Obviously, the evapotranspiration is going to be less. Trees will not be required to water as much. So evapotranspiration is another word that you should be familiar with, because it just tells you the amount of water that gets lost by evaporation and the transpiration of trees. And so when we are now thinking about watering trees, it is very important that you do not water underneath or in surrounding the stem, because that's going to cause rot. Keeping in mind that as the tree roots continue on to grow, to find water, to find those resources that they need in the soil, the feeder roots are going to be held outside the canopy. It is also a false notion that The tree roots only go up to the canopy or the edge of the leaves. That is false. The roots are going to extend way beyond. So when you are going to irrigate the tree, or you're going to be providing trees water to the tree, it is important that you go outside what is known as the drip line. The drip line that is going to be the edge of the leaves or the canopy of the tree. So not directly next to the trunk. Those are only supporting roots. Their job of absorbing is way past. Now, all of the important absorbing roots are going to be found out here in the surrounding soils that are going to be around the tree. And that is why it's amazing that some trees are able to find water from far away, where maybe the neighbor a couple of houses away is watering, and that might be the source of the water for some of the trees for uh, different people. So water outside or several meters away from the trunk so that you maximize the water, or the tree is maximizes the water that's available to it. There is such a thing as too much water, keeping in mind that depending on the type of soil that you may have, depending on compaction, where the soil particles are going to be held so tightly that water is not going to move, or it's going to be taking a very long time to move. So we have such conditions that are referred to as water log. Too much water, it just drains very, very slow. So what happens here is that too much water creates an anaerobic, lack of oxygen condition for the tree, and this will lead to what is known as root rot. Root rot that once it happens, there's nothing that's going to revive that tree. It's dead. So balancing the water where you give it enough to carry out photosynthesis and be happy, and also not enough so that you can bring back the oxygen is going to be very important. And eventually, if the trees are kept very wet, you may get root rot, and you're going to have the root failure. Last time we saw soil failure, where you have the soil plate. So now here are examples of root rot where the root was no longer able to support the tree. This is obviously because of too much water. So you have some of the soil that is very moist. You have the roots that are beginning to not be able to hold the trees. They're going to begin to crack, and eventually as they rupture, then the tree is going to fall. We have here perfect example in a golf course. And the most important thing is the turf. That is what they are paying to play golf on. And so the trees, although they look good, they often are given a lot more water than they need. And so here you have a tree. And as you can see, it's the roots that cave because they slowly rotted. Underneath it, there is nothing. It's amazing this tree was still standing or stood for such a long time. But eventually, when the right winds come through, it's just going to push the tree because there's nothing anchoring it to the ground. So you have very little roots that are still, or that were still helping the tree. Everything else is dead. And so the tree came down. Here's one that was leaning, and then one that fell. And so we went to investigate what was the cause of this tree that fell. And so when we look at it closer, we can see, okay, there's a tree. Underneath, it was a pool of water. So the water was not draining. It was there because the soil had some kind of sandy area, probably part of the root ball when it was planted many years ago. And so the water will naturally kind of pool underneath the tree, creating the problem of the rot, and eventually the tree was just not able to support itself. So something like this is hidden. It's underneath until it is exposed by, in this case, the failing of the tree. And so when we are going to be watering trees, it is very important that you keep away the lawn area. So yes, lawns and trees do not mix because 90% of the time when the lawn is very close to the tree, it would be a maintenance person, a gardener that will come and use the weed whacker to remove the grass from the tree. And that is going to injure the stem, severing the vascular system and killing the tree. So an ideal way would be for you to use organic matter to keep away the grass. Now, organic matter, as we've seen before, is very important for the tree to cool the roots. Also, having a layer of organic matter is going to slow down the evaporation of the water. So it's going to hold it for a little bit longer for the tree. And so this is going to be a benefit for trees as well as a benefit for water conservation. So adding several feet or of mulch surrounding the soil is going to be very, very important. And when you want to plant or place the organic matter, make sure it's about 2 to 5 inches deep or high. So don't pile it too high, and make sure that you don't put it or create a volcano around the stem of the tree, because that's going to keep it way too wet and it could cause some rot. And then you allow the grass to be on the outside because people might still want the grass. And you also want to make sure that if you're going to have this in a automatic irrigation system, that one station is devoted to the trees, because the trees are going to have a very different water regime than the grasses or the grass surrounding turf. So they should have their own system, their own irrigation system, and you would water accordingly to whatever they need. It's also valuable if you happen to get a smart clock that uses a satellite to measure the evapotranspiration. So there's a satellites that are sending signals to the different clocks that lets them know the amount of water that was lost in a 2-3 day cycle from through evaporation and transpiration, and it has to do with the type of trees and the size and all of that. And so the clock will then turn on for just the amount of time that it will take to replace that water that it was lost. So that takes away the guessing game as to how long do I have to water my tree. You only water to replace the water that was lost by the tree or used by the tree, lost to the environment, or lost to the air by evaporation. So very important. You have to think about the tree and protect it from a very young age. Here's things that you should avoid. Here's a very old tree, and avoid putting plants surrounding the trunk, or at least growing up against the trunk, because that can create a very wet area that can create a lot more humidity that the tree wants. The tree trunk should be allowed to dry out, and this could eventually lead to rot. So it is not uncommon for people to try to decorate around the tree. They don't want to see the ground. They don't want to see the trunk. It may not be as attractive. And so they're going to put other greenery around the stem, which in turn is not going to be good for the tree. So avoid planting in the general, or at least very close to the stem if you can. Avoid planting all this annual color. The annual color requires water on a regular basis, and sometimes that might be way too much for some of these trees. So people want to have flowers, and at the end, as they keep on amending the soil, they are going to be disturbing the roots, cutting many of them, opening up ways for pathogens. Now they're going to add a lot of water. That's going to create more of a soggy-like environment, and you already have injured roots. So now it's going to be very easy for pathogens to go into the roots, and eventually that will kill the trees. So avoid putting annual color around the stem or the trunk of the tree, because the damage, as well as a lot more water that is going to be needed for the annual color. Here's an example of a tree that was planted way too close to the building, but it was watered because it had a tropical landscape around it, and this is a pine tree, Aleppo pine, that needed a lot less water. And so, yes, the tropical plants in the back look very happy, and the tree will eventually, or well, not will, eventually it rotted and it fell. Here's in Griffith Park, and it went to the other side of the street. So that took a lot of work to remove. And when we inspected it, there were hardly any roots that were still alive. They were all rotted, and you can see them right there. So no roots. Or I've shown you this picture before of a 800-year-old oak that also they put a building next to it. Also, they kept watering. This is, I think, it was an outdoor restroom. So obviously, there's going to be a lot more water. But as you can see, there are no roots. And once again, it's amazing. The tree was standing and it stood for such a long time. And all of a sudden, the right wind came along and voila, it just pushed it to the side, and then it had to be removed. So probably a combination of damaging the roots and a lot of water that was not good for this tree. And when we look, no roots, they're all being severed off or rotted, and it's just, they're gone. And so when we have the young tree, here's some of the things that you can kind of do. Make sure they are still irrigated. So you have to water them while they're becoming established, and then gradually remove them. Avoid putting them when the grass is, or make sure that you put that buffer zone in between them. And also, when possible, if you're going to get trees that are young, make sure they have branches from top to bottom, because those are going to also be very, very important in protecting a tree when it's very young. So in the very beginning, it is very important that a tree is planted and there is a swale that is going to be built around it. That is going to hold water, so you need to water it there. As the tree becomes established, that swale may need to be widened a little. Most people will never go back to do that. And in the course of several years, that will eventually can be removed. By that time, the roots have already been allowed to establish and grow outside the area, and now they're able to sequester the water from out here and no longer right underneath the stem. When it's very young, the roots are confined to that root ball that came from the container, and so you have to water it right underneath the stem. But as the tree gets established, the new roots are going to be further away, and you have to make that swell a little bit wider, and then eventually it goes away. And I think that is the last slide. So are there any questions on the water? So very, very important. Any question going once? Going twice? Well, thank you for joining the Waters webinar. So I'll stop recording. I'll post it, and